everybody. Welcome. If you are sitting in the back, please know there are some seats up here in the tent, quite literally, so feel free to come up and come in. I'm Dr. Jennifer Ashton. I'm the ABC News Chief Medical Correspondent just until this Thursday. I'm a board-certified OBGYN and also board-certified in obesity medicine and have a degree in nutrition. And I am thrilled to be sharing the stage today with Dr. Lisa Mosconi, truly one of the premier leading scientists in the world. Lisa is director of the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Weill Cornell, New York Presbyterian Hospital, among other things. And you have a PhD in neuroscience and a background in nuclear medicine.
That's right.
And I'm thrilled for this conversation, Menopause in the Brain. So I want to start from the beginning.
Yes.
Good place to start most conversations and most stories. How did you get interested in this field?
So I was born and raised in Florence, in Italy, also in case you wondered about my accent. And I was raised in part by my grandmother. And I should preempt, my parents are nuclear physicists, both of them. Yes.
Underachievers.
They're professors of nuclear physics at the University of Florence. So I really grew into the nuclear medicine field because my mother was teaching nuclear physics to students who then transitioned to nuclear medicine. And they would babysit me. And they would come over to the house and talk to my parents. So that was very normal for me. And from a very young age, I wanted to look at brains and study brain health. And I was really fascinated with neurology and psychiatry, all the brain disciplines. But then my grandmother, when I was in college, she started showing signs of cognitive decline that slowly but surely turned into a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease.
And you were how old?
I think I was about 19, 20 at that point. And she developed full-blown dementia by the time I was doing my PhD, which is in neuroscience and nuclear medicine. And so I made it a point to specialize in Alzheimer's, but in a slightly strange way. And my whole career has been a little bit going against mainstream ideas of what people normally do, because I really started working in Alzheimer's prevention when no one was using the word prevention. So we had to be super careful. And the term back then was risk reduction. And fast forward to today, I do lead the Alzheimer's Prevention Program at Weill Cornell Medicine, New York Presbyterian, and I specialize in women's brain health. So I've been doing this for over 20 years. And we use a combination of neurological exams, neuropsychological testing, the brain imaging, which I bring to the table, and I made sure that it really was an integral part of our program, as well as biological markers, because the goal here is twofold. Number one is Alzheimer's prevention for all people. And number two is really Alzheimer's prevention for women in particular. And our program is really focused at understanding how brain health plays out differently in women than in men. And the reason being that of all Alzheimer's patients out there, which are millions and millions of individuals, unfortunately, nearly 2/3 are women. And for a really long time, this notion and this statistic was completely dismissed by saying that simply the fact is that women live longer than men, and Alzheimer's is a disease of old age. So at the end of the day, unfortunately, more women than men develop Alzheimer's disease. So the very beginning of my career was really focused on kind of dismantling this idea. And I'm going to pause.
So before we get to menopause, which I can't wait to talk about as an OBGYN and a 55-year-old woman, I want to take you all here in the audience down slowly the path, because we're going to connect the dots on a lot of different, very important issues. First, the brain.
The brain.
We are today in medicine and science, maybe where cardiology was 30 years ago. So this is the era of the brain. What have we learned, and how excited are you by the research that's going on right now in the world of neuroscience?
I'm mildly excited. I would like to see more attention being paid to sex differences in neuroscience and brain health, because unfortunately, still today, the assumption is that sex does not matter one bit when it comes to brain health. I know. It is what it is. So the problem has been, it's quite persistent and pervasive in that it's been since the beginning of the field of neuroscience that women were in part excluded from research. And unfortunately, whatever research included women was mostly directed at showing that women's brains were inferior to men's brains.
Yeah.
I know. But this goes back to Charles Darwin, the father of modern biology, who was very adamant to say that women's brains were really like inferior.
And part of that had to do with size, right? Which you talk about in your book, The Menopause Brain.
Yes.
Sometimes size matters, and sometimes it doesn't.
Sometimes it doesn't.
So
Yes.
talk a little bit about that, because that is part of where that misconception really started from.
But we're still stuck with the misconception in many, many ways.
Sure.
So this, again, is Darwin. We're down to the 19th century when scientists finally had the tools to look at the brain, and they realized, they made this big discovery, that men's brains were bigger and heavier than women's brains. And women's brains, on average, weighed in about a few ounces less than a typical man's brain. And that immediately became political propaganda to say that, of course, men are better because their brains are bigger and women have smaller brains, so obviously you're stupid and you should not go to university and you should not hold a job. And it just was turned into some kind of political weapon to just put women in their place, right? And it took many, many years and a lot of scientific advancements to really turn this around. Even just the simple notion that, on average, men's bodies are bigger than women's bodies, right? So once you take size into account, there's actually no difference. But it took a really long time to get there. And at that point, a lot of scientists started denouncing something called neurosexism in research, which is really the assumption that whatever research was done was aimed at validating these outdated notions that women's brains are just not functioning as well as men's brains. And then slowly but surely turned into, well, let's just not even look at this. And so now the assumption is that it doesn't really matter if you're a man or a woman, only there's some ovaries in there.
Right.
So let's stick with the men. They're easier to study. They don't fluctuate as much. And this is a problem today in medicine because we still really teach and practice bikini medicine, where...
Explain what that term means, bikini medicine.
It's a nice term, actually.
Yeah.
It was cute. Bikini medicine is saying that from a medical perspective, what makes a woman are those body parts that fit under a bikini and nothing more. So they're reproductive organs. And you can see this in women's health, right? That whatever is considered a woman's specific health issue is all around reproduction and breasts and ovaries and boobs and tubes. And the assumption is that their brains would work the same way as a man our age.
Right.
And essentially it's saying that women are like smaller and more emotional men. And therefore, whatever drugs I have, I can test them in a bunch of men and then give them to a woman. And we know that that does not work because our metabolism is different, our blood flow is different, our pharmacodynamics are different. And one good example of that is actually Ambien, the most common sleep medication ever, right?
Did you all hear that headline? It was almost 10 years ago.
It was
about Ambien working differently in women. Does that ring a... So Lisa, explain what that was, because that was very
huge.
pointed.
Yeah, incredible. So Ambien was developed and tested on men. First male mice, rodents, and then in clinical trials of humans, but predominantly men. And therefore the dose and frequencies of administration was based on male physiology, to the effect that when the same dosage was given to women, women were effectively overdosing, and nobody realized that. Who realized that? That's very interesting. Insurance companies. Because they noticed, so first the assumption was that women can't drive, and therefore women would get into more car accidents. surprisingly, for whatever reason. But then they realize, well, what all these women who do get into car accidents have in common is that they're taking Ambien to sleep. And so they brought it up, and sure enough, pharmaceutical companies started running tests, and they realized that, yes, the dose is too high for a woman, and they cut it in half. But that took how many years since Ambien hit the market?
Time.
20 years?
Yeah.
Yes. So for many years, women were effectively risking their lives by simply following their physician's recommendations and standardized dosages of a drug that was simply not developed for women or keeping women in mind.
So the dose for anyone who still takes Ambien, 5 milligrams for women.
Yeah.
Not 10,
Not
5.
Yep.
Okay, let's fast forward to the hottest topic in women's health today, menopause. Having a moment.
Yes.
And I am here for it as an OBGYN. I think it's too late, but never late, never better late than never. It's probably going to get even bigger because Kim Kardashian is 43.
Ouch.
So she's probably about to have her first hot flash any minute. And when she does, 370 million people are going to hear about it. So it's going to get even more attention. But 1 to 2 million American women in this country enter menopause every single year. By the year 2030, it will represent a $26 billion global market. There will be 1 billion women in menopause around the world. So I'm sure you and I are in agreement that it's time people start paying attention to this phase in life. So talk us through how you got interested in studying the effects of estrogen in the female brain. And then we'll get to the big news.
Yeah, the big news. I honestly never would have thought that I would be here talking about menopause. It was extremely foreign to me because even physicians, when you go through residency, only 1 in 5 OBGYN residents receive any training in menopause care. I can assure you, neuroscientists get zero.
Zero. Right.
So it was really our research that led us to menopause as a very important risk factor for diminished brain health in women. I'm going to explain what I mean here. So we were studying Alzheimer's disease, and especially we were trying to catch the earliest possible signs of Alzheimer's in women's brains, also men's brains, but again, we unapologetically go for women's brains. And so we were going younger and younger, and we were looking at individuals in their 40s and 50s. And by looking at brain scans, we could tell that the women's brains showed more red flags for Alzheimer's disease as compared to the brains of men who were exactly the same age. But we couldn't find a reason for it. Is it just sex? People always say to me, it's just aging, right? I keep getting that's just aging. But they're the same age.
Right.
So we need to find other factors. And we look at everything. We look at genetics, we looked at lifestyle, we looked at medical comorbidities, we looked at medication history. And everything helped out a little, but it couldn't quite explain the difference until my students were performing neuropsychological testing on one of our patients, a woman in her late 40s, early 50s, who was having a really hard time focusing on the test. And they said, can we open the windows? Can we get you a little water? She said, that's completely useless. I'm having hot flashes. I can't think straight. And there was this silence, like, you're having what? Because we had never talked about menopause, right? And so she was having such a hard time that she had to stop and come back another time, just perfectly fine. But my students freaked out royally. So they ran to me and said she had to stop. I'm so sorry. She was having hot flashes. I was like, oh, that's interesting, actually. There's preclinical research showing that estrogen declines and menopausal changes do impact the brain. So why don't we go back and ask all the women in the study about their menstrual cycle, which is very strange for us to do. Very strange. So we went to the OBGYN department.
That must have gone over like a lead balloon when you suggested that, right?
Yes. Everybody was like,
asking
are you okay?
Question. Right.
Yes. But so we started working with them, and we were able to characterize every woman as having a regular menstrual cycle, so being premenopausal, having an irregular menstrual cycle, perimenopause, or not having anymore a menstrual cycle of 12 months plus. And once you do that, it's obvious that premenopausal women and men of the same age, no difference. But when you start looking at perimenopausal women and men of the same age, more red flags for Alzheimer's disease. Less brain energy, less gray matter, reduced connectivity. And once you look at postmenopausal women and compare them to men of the same age, the differences are even clearer. And that was 2017. And that turned into the first paper, which I had no idea was the first, but it turned into the first examination of women's brains before and after menopause with brain imaging in 2017. Oh, thank you. I think it's offensive. I think it's offensive.
Yeah.
As a woman and a scientist, 2017, nobody's done it. And so now
trust me, if men had hot flashes, this code would have been cracked centuries ago.
Yes, I agree.
But again, now, Friday, just off embargo.
And we were emailing. And
That's
texting.
right. And I'm so excited for you to share this with this audience here at Aspen Ideas Health. You published for the first time, let that sink in, the results of your research showing the differences with PET scans of how estrogen acts in the brain, and you're going to take us through your findings. So
yes, so because we were doing this work on menopause, we were looking at blood flow and energy levels and connectivity and gray matter volume and Alzheimer's plaques, and the assumption was always that these differences, these changes, were driven by declining estrogen levels in the brain. And I need to preempt. We can measure hormones in blood, but there's no correlation between hormones in blood and hormones in brain. Why? Because the brain is a fantastic organ that has its own ecosystem and works partially independent of the ovaries. They work together, of course, they communicate, but the brain maintains a different hormonal system as compared to the ovaries, which is wonderful. Otherwise, we would lose our minds pretty much every month, right? But the point is, I went to my radiochemistry department, and I said, I need to measure estrogen in the brain. And look, we have a fabulous radiochemistry department. It's the reason, one of the reasons I moved to Cornell is that we can make our own tracers for the brain, which is very unique. It takes a village, really. And they said, I need something to see estrogen in the brain. What are my choices? And they said, you have none. There are no choices. I said, is it just us?
Yeah.
Or does anybody else have tools, something I can say? No, there are no tracers that work inside the brain. That was 2019, and once again I said, well, this is unacceptable. We need to be able to measure estrogen in the brain. And so, fast forward to today, we succeeded, and this is in fact the first ever brain imaging study to measure any hormones in
So
the brain.
let's put up the slide and then
put up the slide.
Take everyone
Thank
through
you.
this,
Thank you. Yeah. So this is 5 years of my life, and is also showing two things. Number one, we are able to measure estrogen inside the brain, which people thought was not possible. People tried. Some people tried. I can tell you why we succeeded, but it's a long story. The point is that we made it. And we published this first study when we're looking at women at different menopausal stages. So we have women who have a regular menstrual cycle, women who are perimenopausal, they're transitioning, and women who are postmenopausal. And before I tell you what these images show, I have to tell you that the theory that we were testing was based on mice. And what happens to mice is that their brains kind of shut down soon after menopause. Specifically, so the way the hormones work is like...
That's from Mother Nature.
She's like, congratulations, let me give you a tornado. Right. All right, she's calm.
Yeah.
So the way the hormones work is that hormones just carry information but the information is to reach a reader, which is called a receptor. So the hormone is to unlock this receptor, and the combination of the two is what really powers brain health. So you actually need to have active receptors for any hormones to work. What happens is in mice, evidently, is that the receptors shut down. They're no longer being made a few years after menopause, which is one reason the neurologists are not usually involved in the clinical workup of menopause, because we're thinking, well, you only have a couple of years, pretty much, and then the brain is done. What we found is exactly the opposite, that in women's brains, estrogen receptors do not die down, they do not disappear. Actually, we have more. So if you look at the colors there, the color-coded scale shows estrogen receptor density, which is how many receptors you have in any unit of tissue of the brain. And the parts in red have a lot of receptors, and the parts in blue have none. I hope you can see the difference, where the premenopausal brain is mostly blue and green, but the postmenopausal brain has a lot more yellow and red. That means there are more estrogen receptors after menopause. And what's really interesting about this woman is that she's 65 years old. That's over 14 years after the final menstrual period. So we have a much wider window of opportunity, we believe, to intervene and feed these receptors. Because to me, at least, and again, we need validation, confirmation, we need a larger sample, we need more studies, but what these results suggest is that when you have estrogen, endogenous estrogen, like the premenopausal woman, the receptors are happy, they're busy. They're chewing up that estrogen, and that's why we don't see them. But in the postmenopausal brain, they're there, they're wide open, they're upregulated, it's called upregulation, most likely because they're hungry for estradiol. This is specifically a tracer for estradiol, which is the most abundant form of estrogen during a woman's reproductive life.
So I think it's very important for people to understand that the way hormones work in our body is not always one way. That
Right.
they can either upregulate or downregulate, depending on what the hormone is and how much of that said hormone is around. But what I think is so compelling about these visual images is that this shows that when the female brain, even as you said, 15, 14 years after the average age of menopause, does not see estrogen, it doesn't say, well, I guess you're not coming back, I'm going to shut down.
Exactly.
It does the opposite. It looks for that hormone.
Yeah.
Were there any more that you wanted to go through on this,
No,
Lisa?
No, that was the only slide. I mean, I have so many I would like to show. But
Okay,
we only brought one.
so what's important about this is a lot of you here may know that in the world of gynecology, there still is the misconception that there's a critical window of time by which a woman could be offered or could benefit from hormone replacement therapy. Talk a little bit about that window of opportunity,
Yes.
because this might throw a real monkey wrench in that, in a good way.
I'm hoping it does. In cardiology, for example, the window of opportunity is about 10 years. Most clinicians would recommend either stopping or not starting hormone therapy more than 10 years past the final menstrual period. In neurology, that window is 5 years. So we're told, we're not even allowed to deal with menopause by ourselves, which is bizarre. But the idea is that you only have about 5 years to start hormone therapy. And what this study is showing is that we're looking at more than 15 years where the brain is still wanting estradiol and actively wanting estradiol. So one thing that's interesting, I think, from a neuroscience perspective is that estrogen works in balance with the receptors, right? When there's a certain amount of estrogen, the brain needs to make a certain number of receptors to meet the needs. It's not just the receptors are there waiting for the estradiol to arrive. It's the brain that makes them every single day over life. And when you have a lot of estradiol, like close to ovulation, the brain can make fewer receptors. But when estradiol goes down, evidently the brain upregulates the estrogen production, which is a very smart, I believe, intelligent adaptation that we had no clue our brain would even be able to make, right? So I think women's brains really should get more credit at any stage of our lives. And the implications of this research are, at this time, endless. Because, for instance, there's over 160 million women who are using hormone therapies, whether birth control, right, hormonal birth control, or hormone therapy for menopause, or endocrine therapies for cancer. We have no clue what any of these therapies do to women's brains. No clue, because we did not have a technology that allowed us to check.
Or the interest.
Yes, or the interest. But now we do. So there's so much that we need to do, and we're hoping other scientists will learn about this and come work with us. So we're happy to share.
You mentioned you studied women up to the age of 65.
Yes.
When you, obviously you will study up to 70, 75, 80.
Yeah.
So it's possible that you might see a similar effect even at those other ages. So there's nothing that anyone should interpret as magic about age 65 right now.
No. Age 65 is because of this window of opportunity theory. When I said we're going to go up to age 65, everybody looked at me like I had two heads. But they're like, well, I think we should stop at 55, perhaps 60. And there was a no, I think I really want to capture the whole window of opportunity, which turns out we're not capturing. We need to go 70, perhaps 80. We'll keep going.
Right. So if a woman is 60 years old, 63, 65 years old, and goes to see her gynecologist or healthcare provider, and they say, sorry, your window of opportunity has closed, that woman should say, well, open it.
Maybe. Let's see.
Right?
Let's check. And the other thing, if I may, another thing that blood tests cannot do for you, in many cases, is predict whether or not you're going to have symptoms of menopause, whereas these brain scans do. So by measuring estrogen receptor density, we are able to predict with almost 100% certainty, actually 100% certainty, whether a woman is postmenopausal or not, which a blood test cannot do for you. And we're able to predict whether these women are having brain fog, memory lapses, attention, reduced focus, and or mood changes, which are very typical brain symptoms of menopause that are experienced by over 2/3, or perhaps nearly 2/3 of all women. And they're not usually considered something that hormone therapy may help with. Right. I mean, most mild depressive symptoms, yes. But I think that there's more to mood changes.
Brain fog, mood changes, anxiety, depression.
Yes. So we're hoping...
Significant menopausal symptoms.
Yes. So this is the first time that any measure can predict whether a woman has brain fog or not, as far as I know.
Congratulations on this research. It's really incredible.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, we owe it to women. We owe it to women. Yeah. Women have been underserved for so long, and so many of our patients come to us because of brain fog, which can be so severe that they're really terrified that they might be developing early onset dementia. And so I thought, well, look, we need to find a test that can help us. Because Alzheimer's disease the diagnosis is done in old age, but we can see signs today. However, those signs are not a guarantee that somebody's going to get dementia. So we really need to be more careful and better equipped in terms of exclusion. Yeah. We need to be better at diagnosing. And
I want to talk about brain health in men as well.
Okay.
And by the way, I would like to give a round of applause to the men who came to this
panel.
You. Because I was sharing with you yesterday, Lisa, you know, there are thousands of male OBGYNs. Mm-hmm. Silent largely on this issue. Men need to be part of this discussion in the world of science, in society. Yes. Men have women that they care about, that they want to support in terms of their brain health as they age, and also through this reproductive and hormonal stage in life. So I applaud every man who came to this, and I hope others follow in your stead. Let's talk about some things that women can do and men can do, but I want to start with women and hormone replacement therapy, and the pros and cons of that and how it can improve brain health.
Yeah, so hormone therapy has a little bit of a bad reputation, which is unfortunately based on this study, the Women's Health Initiative, that is now over 20 years old. And somehow we're still stuck with that. That's very surprising to me because there's been quite a lot of research done since then where we clearly identified the limitations of that study. And I'm happy to talk about it a little bit from a brain perspective, which is maybe a little different. And I think that hormone therapy is now seeing a little bit of a renaissance, if you will, which I think it's a very good thing. So the Women's Health Initiative remains the largest clinical trial of hormone replacement therapy for prevention of cardiovascular disease, but also for relief of hot flashes and for prevention of dementia. Well, what happened with that, I'm just going to give you the shortest possible version of this history. They started working on this trial and putting it together in the early 1990s. Now, brain scientists only discovered that estrogen is also a brain hormone in 1996, right? So when the WHI investigators were putting together this clinical trial for dementia prevention, they actually had no idea how estrogen worked in the brain, like zero, not even in mice, what I meant. So they were really kind of, I think they did a fantastic job with the information that they had. Right. But they had some very clear limitation in that heart disease, stroke, dementia is something that is diagnosed in older age. So they started working with women who were in their 60s, mostly 70s and 80s. And at that point, although I'm not so sure about that anymore, but the idea is that at that point, those women were perhaps too old to really benefit from hormone therapy. There's another potential explanation, which is that the hormones that were used back then were more aggressive on the vascular system as compared to the micronized estradiol and micronized progesterone that we use today, especially when delivered via transdermal routes. So fast forward to last year, I got really tired of hearing that hormone therapy gives you dementia. And I said, yes, the Women's Health Initiative is one thing, but there are over 40 other studies that looked at the effects of HRT on dementia risk. And many of them show positive preventative effects. So the only way to really get some clarity is to do something called a meta-analysis, which is a statistical integration of all available data. And when you do that, and now I wish I had a figure, but when you do that, you see that hormone therapy started in midlife as women go through menopause or right after the final menstrual period is actually protective against dementia. So estrogen alone for women with a hysterectomy was associated with a significant 32% risk reduction. Estrogen with a progestogen, more often than not a synthetic progestin, so not micronized progesterone, that was associated with a trend towards a risk reduction of 23%. So that was more variable, in part because studies that used the synthetic forms showed more neutral to elevated risk, whereas studies of micronized progesterone showed more protective effects. Instead, starting hormone therapy at older ages would either had neutral effects or a non-significant increase in risk. So I want more studies that look at the brain.
Of course.
Yeah.
So that's very, very important, bottom line. If you take one thing from this panel, other than the fact that you literally sat with one of the foremost neuroscientists in the world who presented data that had never been shown before, that you may go to your gynecologist and ask about hormone replacement therapy, and she or he may not be current in the last several years, or even the methodologic flaws in the WHI study, which came out in 2002.
That's right.
And there's a lot of blame, there's a lot of anger from women who say, my doctor never told me. Let's I like this saying. I use it with my children all the time, but I think it applies also to medicine and science. Be careful when you point a finger, because there could be 3 pointing back at you. Let's not waste time blaming. If the person's not current or up to date, they're not. Move on, educate yourselves. Your book, The Menopause Brain, is an incredible resource. There are a lot of others. There are a lot of doctors who are current on this data.
Yes.
But the comment that I have heard in my 19 years of clinical practice as an OBGYN, and I bet a lot of women sitting here are thinking the very same thing, when they talk about hormone replacement therapy, what's the first risk that people ask about?
Breast cancer.
Okay, so I shared this with you yesterday.
Yes.
In almost 20 years of talking to women about hormone replacement therapy or even birth control pills, breast cancer is the first thing that comes up. And I say, actually, WHI data was flawed. There is no increased risk in breast cancer, and certainly no significantly increased risk in breast cancer. But you know what does increase the risk of breast cancer? Conclusively, significantly? Alcohol consumption. And I have never had a single patient in 20 years say, really? Then I'm not going to drink a drop of alcohol. Not one. So I would like you, Lisa, please to speak about the effects of alcohol on the brain, and this time also potentially for men as well.
I'll add, I don't drink a drop of alcohol.
Not a drop.
Not a drop. In part because the science is quite clear. Like you were saying, alcohol is a risk for drinking alcohol.
Not even one Aperol Spritz? You're Italian.
No. I might tonight.
That's right.
But I think what you said is so important, because we've heard the headlines that hormone replacement gives you cancer. And that's what scares so many women. But this information, the data, has never been put in context. And I think this is so important to say, even in the Women's Health Initiative, where there was a slightly increased risk of breast cancer for a very specific type of formulation, the risk was still significantly smaller than that associated with drinking 2 glasses of wine a day, right? But nobody tells you that. They just tell you there's an increased risk. And that has scared women away from hormone therapy, whereas a lot of women drink in menopause just to take the edge off, I suppose, to feel a little bit more relaxed, which makes sense. But so what is alcohol? Alcohol, from a chemical perspective, is a dehydrating agent. That's the main functionality of alcohol, is to dehydrate. Now, which organ in your entire body is most sensitive to dehydration? Your brain. Exactly. So the brain is mostly made of water. You may have heard that the brain is mostly fat. Nope, it's actually mostly water. And even very mild dehydration, like a 2 to 4% water loss, has been associated with neurological symptoms like headaches, migraines, dizziness, brain fog, vertigo, and reduced reaction
What about
times.
bitchiness? Is that I am very often dehydrated, if you ask my children.
But so I think it's important to realize that hydration is really important for the entire body, but especially for brain health. So that's one more reason to be mindful of alcohol intake. Also caffeine. Caffeine is mildly dehydrating for the brain, not so much for the rest of the body, because at least in this country, people drink a lot of water with their coffee. Espresso is a different story. Yeah. But just be mindful, like if you're drinking a little bit of alcohol, just drink water with it. In Italy, when you have your espresso, they always bring you a glass of water with it, which I think is a good idea.
I want to open it up for some questions, because we have 11 minutes, so we'd like to take some questions. Yes, can you stand up? And we're bringing microphones. Thank you.
Hi.
Thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative.
Good.
I have wondered about hormone replacement therapy relative to people who do not have menopausal symptoms. So I know that that's typically when it's considered, and when I went to a doctor who said to me, but you don't have any symptoms.
That's a great question.
Why are you doing this? And the question is, what does those hormones, and I never realized there was a distinction between hormones in the brain and hormones in the body, which is super fascinating. And what does that impact have in doing that hormone replacement therapy if you don't have any postmenopause?
It's very funny. We were just talking about this just before the session. And what I said, which is what I will repeat today, is that there is an official, standardized, FDA-approved answer, and then there's an answer that we give to a friend. And they're not the same. And I'm going to leave it at that. But I will tell you that right now, hormone therapy is not FDA approved for prevention of anything except osteoporosis for women who do not yet obviously have osteoporosis. It is not approved for anything preventative, whether cardiovascular or neurological. I'm going to take a deep breath here because my concern is that we all know that there's about a 14-year gap between the research being published and the guidelines of professional societies being updated. I'm not going to wait 14 years, So at this point, there are no specific guidelines, and I understand your doctor's concerns because your doctor is liable in case something happens to you. What would you say?
I would say also, and I appreciate that question, that we use medications off-label in this country every single day, safely and effectively. And my big thing is communication, and you should know from your provider whether you're being offered something in an off-label kind of modality. And that's up to you and your provider to decide whether you want to take that risk for the possible benefits. It's a risk-benefit discussion. I want to make sure we get to some other questions. Yes?
But I would also say, give us a year, because we're testing.
She works very
right
fast. Yes.
We try.
Just to follow up on that, if you were to do an exogenous estrogen through a patch, what about the point you made about it not actually crossing the blood-brain barrier?
Oh, it does cross. Estradiol crosses the blood-brain barrier by passive diffusion. It's actually very, very easy to get it in. What's hard for us is to get a tracer inside the brain. It's a very different thing. So we were able, one reason I think we succeeded is that we took estradiol, like the same thing that the ovaries makes, so 17-beta estradiol, and we labeled it with a fluorinating compound, which is a very standard radioactive isotope for PET imaging. And we were kind of fortunate that we were able to get this tracer inside the brain, number one, where a lot of other tracers don't cross. And number two, it gave us enough of a signal to get not just the images, but also to get a difference between different menopausal stages. There's a lot of things that go into this calculation and equation. So estradiol goes inside the brain. Estradiol from the patch, I don't know how much gets in because nobody's ever done. We're doing it now. That's what I was going to say. We're doing it now. We have 3 different studies going on at the same time. And my goal is to compare different types of formulations and medications for, I want to look at CEEs, conjugated equine estrogens. I want to look at Premarin, which was used in the WHO. I want to look at transdermal. I want to look at oral and see how these different therapies may or may not feed those receptors.
Any questions?
So I don't have an answer yet, but hopefully soon.
Yes, sir, in the front. Hold on. Here comes your microphone.
So as an entrepreneur and a man in medicine, how do I be mindful of the just lopsidedness of female studies and everything that seems to be extremely behind the times? How can I be active in trying to push that forward, which seems like it's still not as caught up as I maybe thought it was before I came into the session?
Well, you're here, so that's a great first step. So
That's a great first step.
Yeah, but that's just an hour, so
Yeah.
what do I do on Monday?
Well, I think education is key, just knowing what the limitations are, what's been done and what has not been done. And that's the thing, helping just having an open conversation with men and women about what menopause is and isn't. There's such stigma, there's so much bias around menopause, where so many women are really still reluctant to even talk about the fact that they're going through menopause. I've had so many patients who come to us and they're they've been through a very rough couple of years, and they're now past it, and maybe they're on hormones, or perhaps they're managing their menopause with lifestyle interventions or supplements or cognitive behavioral therapy. We look at everything. There's no right or wrong solution. Whatever works for you is the right solution for you, right? But there's no sense of achievement. Right. There's no sense of just, this is a phase of my life that is very much worth going through, I believe, right? And the same way you go through puberty and everybody's so excited for you, and then perhaps you get pregnant and there's baby showers and balloons and gifts and everybody's so happy. You go through menopause and nobody wants to hear about it.
I know. Everyone should throw themselves a menopause party.
We were talking about it, yes. My husband left
right?
for some reason. But yes, I was telling Kevin, I want to party.
Yeah. But I think the first step for men, whether you're a medical professional or just, a partner, a father, a sister, a brother, a friend, is to listen.
Yes, and be
to
supportive.
Validate, to acknowledge without judgment, and not to say, as women are told in everything, whether they're having chest pain and a MI or heart attack, or whether they're having pregnancy complications, or whether they're having hot flashes, it's in your head. Well, it is in your head, literally. You've proven that. But, dismissive. I think that's a great first place to start, and to actually look for some of the positives. I say a lot of times, you may have heard me say it on Good Morning America, I said it in my practice and in my books, it's a privilege to go through menopause, because the alternative is you're dead. So it's all about the way that we help a woman through this phase in her life, I think. Yes, in the back there.
So with all of the research now on hormone replacement therapy, what about the growing cohort of women who can't take hormone replacement therapy?
Thank you for asking. So we're coming.
Great question.
So first of all, there are non-hormonal remedies that can really help, from some antidepressants to the newly approved drugs that are non-hormonal, like fezolinetant, Veoza, sometimes gabapentin can help, clonidine. So there are non-hormonal options. Some women honestly prefer to take no prescription medications and just manage their symptoms with lifestyle and behavioral management. Professional societies do recommend CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and clinical hypnosis. We will love a type of estrogen that can go straight up inside your brain without increasing any risk of anything in any other part of the body. We have it. We're doing a clinical trial right now of a neuroSERM. Neuro as in brain, SERM as in selective estrogen receptor modulator. What this genius formulation, in my opinion, was developed by a colleague of mine, Dr. Roberta Diaz-Brinton at the University of Arizona, and she is a complete rock star in my field. She's been studying estrogen since, the Women's Health Initiative, perhaps before. And she was able to create this plant derivative compound, which is not really plants, but it's a cocktail of estrogen that very specifically goes inside your brain, powers up neurons, improves energy levels in the brain. We're testing it for Alzheimer's prevention as well. But what it does, it has a very specific neutral or inhibitory effect on cell proliferation in the reproductive system, which means it does not increase the risk of reproductive cancers. We're testing it now. It's not yet available clinically, but the trial is ongoing. And I'm hoping, we have 3 years to finish it. So in 3 years, we should know. And I know a lot of other scientists are working to develop these SERMs very specifically, because you can make them do what you want. In some ways, they're being used for cancer, like tamoxifen is a very common SERM. And what we're trying to do is to really have estrogens that give you all the goodness, the estrogens, without any concern, which is not to say that hormone therapy is bad. I want to be really clear about it. It's an alternative.
Right. We have time for one more very quick question right here in the front. Yeah.
Hello.
First of all, when we get home, I'm going to have a menopause and margarita party.
Yes. Well, okay.
I'm going to have to start drinking.
Only one. But my question to y'all is, what are your feelings on pharmaceutical hormone replacement versus bioidentical?
Well, what do you mean?
Well, like the pellet that I am carrying in my body right now. synthetic?
How do you feel
So
about that?
just briefly, the term bioidentical is a marketing term.
Yeah.
That bioidentical means it resembles the hormones that you make in your body. There's pharmaceutical grade bioidenticals
Yes.
and there's compounded bioidenticals. And while there are some reputable compounding pharmacies, the analogy I always give, and I'm not saying this because you and I are both Italian, but it's like making a lasagna. If you go to a restaurant and order lasagna, you don't know what's going on in the kitchen, but what comes out is going to look like a lasagna, but you don't know what's going into it. When you get a compounded form of any medication, you don't know how it's being made in the kitchen. There's pharmaceutical grade bioidentical, which is subject to the same rigorous testing and FDA oversight as any other medication that may be, synthetic or whatnot. But don't be tricked into any false sense of security that something called bioidentical has any miraculously different risk or benefit profile than anything that's pharmaceutical grade. Would you agree with that?
Oh, completely. We recommend pharmaceutical tested hormones, yes, bioidentical or otherwise, but they have to be tested and approved by the FDA for me.
Again, your book, Menopause Brain, which is on sale here, is an incredible resource. I know we're going to be hearing a lot more from your lab and your center in the future. You're helping millions and millions of women around the country and the world. How can people follow you on social media?
So I actually am on social media.
Yes, you are.
Surprisingly. I cannot do Twitter. I'm too sensitive for Twitter. Can't do that. But I am on Instagram, and I do answer as many messages as I can. So my handle is Dr.Mosconi, Mosconi. Also, my website.
I follow you. Yes,
I follow you too.
And I'm on Instagram only because I agree. Twitter is they're very mean.
I don't have the stomach.
I like the nice Instagram at DRJ Ashton. So, and I also try to answer myself those questions. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
For this.
Thank you.
Thank you.